On the morning of April 4th, 1968, in the heart of the United States, in a small Iowa town called Riceville, third-grade teacher Jane Elliott turned on her radio, as she did every morning, and was shocked by the news she heard. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated the day before on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. At that moment, standing in her kitchen with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, Elliott felt something break inside her. Because just a few months prior, she and her students had read King's "I Have a Dream" speech in class, and the children had asked, "Teacher, why do people hate each other? Why does skin color even matter?" Elliott hadn't been able to give a satisfying answer to these questions. Riceville, Iowa, a town of just over 800 people, surrounded by cornfields, where everyone knew everyone, where people leaving church on Sunday mornings chatted with the baker in his apron, the kind of American town where children didn't even have to lock their bikes in front of their doors. And in this town, racism was an abstract concept, because there were almost no black people living in the town. They only knew racism from television, from news coming out of the South, from Martin Luther King's speeches, but it didn't exist on the concrete sidewalks of Riceville, in the school corridors, or in the silence of a Wednesday afternoon. Which is exactly why Elliott's task was both more difficult and more important: to materialize an abstract concept, to bring a distant pain closer, to make what was seen as their problem feel like everyone's reality. And to do this, on the morning of April 5th, 1968, the day after Martin Luther King's assassination, she walked into the class, crossed her arms, looked at her students, 28 children, all white, all innocent, all safe, all completely unaware that they were right in the middle of the experiment she had set up for that day, and she began to speak quietly, but with determination. "Today I am going to teach you something different," Elliott called out to the class, and her voice was so calm, so measured, so teacher-like, that the children listened carefully. "Brown-eyed people are superior to blue-eyed people," she said, and as 28 pairs of eyes looked at her in astonishment, the air in the room changed silently but tangibly. Question marks appeared in some children's eyes, but their hands didn't go up because their teacher was saying it, and teachers are infallible, especially if you are in the 3rd grade and your teacher is Jane Elliott. Because in that small town, Elliott wasn't just a teacher, she was an authority, she was trust, she was the truth. The brown-eyed children sat up straight, their shoulders squared. They smiled. They felt as if they had finally received a crown they inherently deserved. The blue-eyed children, however, shrank inward, looked on with doubt but did not object. And then Elliott explained the rules. The brown-eyed children would move to the front rows on the warm and sunny side of the classroom. They could stay outside for 5 extra minutes during recess. They would eat first in the cafeteria, and they could freely use the water fountain. The blue-eyed children, on the other hand, would be moved to the back rows. A blue fabric collar would be placed around their necks to classify them. They would use separate plastic cups to drink water. Elliott presented this under the guise of hygiene. They would be last in the cafeteria, and playing with the brown-eyed children during recess was forbidden. And the children, 8, 9 years old, the most innocent beings in the world, did not object to these rules because the authority had spoken, and the authority was right, wasn't she? At the end of the first hour, Elliott came into the classroom and brought a blue-eyed boy to the board and asked a simple math question. The child got a question wrong that he knew, or perhaps he couldn't do it even though he could have, because he felt the stares of the class behind him, and those stares were different now. It was as if they were saying, "You are the lower class, you are inadequate, you are less valuable." Elliott turned to the class with a cold voice and said, "Do you see? This is why blue-eyed people are less successful." And in that moment, in that single sentence, a prophecy fulfilled itself. The mechanism known in social psychology as the Pygmalion Effect, or the self-fulfilling prophecy, was activated. The boy bowed his head in shame and truly began to believe he was inadequate. Because his teacher said so, the class looked at him that way. The system was designed that way. In just a few hours, the exam scores of the blue-eyed children plummeted, their reading speed slowed, their attention spans shortened. And this change wasn't fake, it wasn't performative, it was real. because the human brain processes what it is told. The believed thing comes true. The label attached to an identity eventually becomes the identity itself. The test scores of the brown-eyed children, however, went up. The same children, the same intelligence, the same knowledge, but a different label, a different status, a different self-perception, and as a result, a different performance. When Elliott went home on the evening of that first day, she slept very little because she was trying to digest what she had seen. In just a few hours, with just a few rules and labels, even children, the most innocent state of humans, were ready to become ruthless when they found the opportunity to gain power, both to be oppressed and to oppress. But the truly devastating part wasn't the changing test scores. The truly devastating part was children who had been best friends the previous day, who had grown up in the same neighborhood, played with the same toys, spent every day together, became alienated from one another. When a brown-eyed boy approached his blue-eyed best friend at recess, he said, "I can't play with you. If I am like you, it will be bad." This sentence was spoken by an 8-year-old child to the friend he had run, laughed, and shared with all day yesterday, and that friend cried. What was even graver is that he didn't just cry, he felt something break inside him. He began to carry that immense pain in his tiny body, and this pain wasn't the abstract racism described in books. It was completely concrete, completely real. A very deep pain like sitting alone at recess, not daring to approach the water fountain, reading his own inadequacy in the teacher's gaze. In the afternoon, Elliott observed. The blue-eyed children became increasingly quieter, spoke less, slumped in their chairs. A part of their identity had been taken from them, and this had only taken one day. On the other hand, the brown-eyed children had changed. They were speaking louder, raising their hands more, calling each other we. But this "we" was no longer a unity, it was exclusionary. In the cafeteria, when a blue-eyed boy mistakenly got into the wrong line, the brown-eyed kids pointed at him and shouted, "Teacher, there is a blue-eyed kid here, get him out!" And that boy's face flushed with great shame. He bowed forward, silently moved to the correct line. Elliott, at that moment, her eyes burning, felt that this happens every day, everywhere, in every system in the world. How quickly even a small privilege can change a person. How quickly they can start degrading the others. On the second day, the morning of April 6th, Elliott entered the classroom and announced, "I was wrong yesterday. I did more research and learned that blue-eyed people are superior to brown-eyed people. They are smarter, more talented," she said. The reaction of 28 pairs of eyes was unbelievable. The shoulders of the children, who had been shoved into the corner with blue collars around their necks yesterday, opened up. Their breathing deepened. A momentary joy flashed on their faces. But there was also something else in their eyes. The anger of what they lived yesterday. The desire for revenge. And what about the brown-eyed children? The children who had learned they were superior just yesterday, who thought their privileges would continue from now on, were shocked. Blue collars were placed around their necks. They were pulled to the back rows, and something unexpected happened. Even though it had only been 24 hours since the blue-eyed children had experienced it, they acted ruthlessly the moment they were on top. Perhaps with the anger of yesterday's pain, perhaps intoxicated by the power the system gave them, a blue-eyed girl said to her brown-eyed friend, "You stupid people are always like this." And this sentence created a freezing silence in the classroom because the same child, the same mouth, had experienced the exact opposite just a day before. Elliott noted this down, and this observation was crucial. The oppressed, the moment they take power into their hands, do not automatically become merciful. On the contrary, they can sometimes be more aggressive, more vengeful, because while the memory of pain is fresh, power intoxicates, and this dynamic has been repeated countless times in history on different scales. On the afternoon of the second day, Elliott decided it was time to end the experiment. She gathered the children together, asked them to stand up, and first took off the collars from the necks of the blue-eyed children, then the brown-eyed ones. One by one, slowly, as if she was lifting a burden from their shoulders while taking off each collar, and she looked at the class. Some children were crying, hugging each other. Some looked confused. Some were buried in a deep silence, and Elliott began to speak. "Nothing changed during these 2 days, except the color of your eyes. Not your intelligence, not your talent, not your value. but I saw how, with one sentence, some of you stopped believing in yourselves, and some of you degraded your friends. Right now, millions of people in the Southwest, North, East, everywhere in America experience this every day, not because of the color of their eyes, but the color of their skin, not just for 2 days, but every day, from the day they are born until the day they die. Remember what you feel right now, because that feeling is real, that pain is real. And if you do not want to be someone who wants to inflict that pain on others, do not forget today, she said, and the class cried, a collective, sincere, devastating cry. Not just the third grade students, but Elliott herself was crying too, because those 2 days had transformed her as well. She had seen both the darkest and the most hopeful thing about humanity, the dark part, how easily we can become bad, and the hopeful part, how quickly we can change when we see the truth. What happened after the experiment was perhaps as instructive as the experiment itself. In 1970, when ABC News broadcast the experiment as a documentary under the name Eye of the Storm, America was shaken. Millions of people watched on screens how 8-year-old children treated each other, how a simple system established by the teacher transformed them. And most people cried. Most people said, "This is like what is being done to us." Most people experienced the concrete, visual, emotional counterpart of an abstract concept for the first time. The documentary won an Emmy Award, was broadcast worldwide, began to be used in educational programs. Years later, Melinda Wisenhunt, one of the students in that class, would say this in front of the cameras. Not a single day goes by. It changed my life, and this sentence was the simplest proof of how deep traces an experiment could leave, how real and permanent those 2 days were. Over the years, Elliott expanded the experiment and repeated it countless times, not just with children, but with adults too. She worked in corporate training programs, in universities, with prison staff, with police departments, with government institutions, and every time she faced the same result. The group given the superior status began to demean the other within hours, while the group placed in the lower status rapidly lost its self-confidence. It didn't matter what the age was, it didn't matter what the education was, it didn't even matter to those who said, "I am not racist." In 1985, she repeated the experiment with adults on live television on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and the results were almost the same as with the children. The blue-eyed adults became humiliated, irritable, unproductive within hours. The brown-eyed ones, on the other hand, relaxed, thought better, produced more, and the Oprah studio burst into tears because everyone there understood. This was not just an experiment, it was the mirror of America's daily reality. After that broadcast, Elliott said, "If 2 hours felt unbearable for you, imagine what it is like for someone who lives this every day of their life. And don't ever ask, why are they so angry, again." And this sentence is perhaps the most concise, the most powerful summary of her career of decades. The scientific significance of the Jane Elliott experiment is concentrated in a few critical points. First, it reveals the self-fulfilling prophecy mechanism so strikingly, the label affecting performance, the expectation shaping the result, the judgment attached to the identity becoming the identity itself over time. Second, showing that privilege is not learned, but systematically given. No one is born racist, but when the system grants privilege, people internalize it, do not question it, even get defensive. Third, proving that the most effective way of empathy is not intellectual, but experiential. The children who lived the discrimination for 2 days remembered those 2 days even 50 years later. And the fourth, perhaps the most disturbing one, the experience of being oppressed does not automatically create merciful individuals. On the contrary, when power is achieved, the experience of being oppressed can turn into a motive for revenge. And without breaking this cycle, neither individual nor social transformation is possible. There were dozens of subsequent studies confirming Elliott's findings. Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson's Pygmalion in the Classroom research, 1968, Claude Steele's Stereotype Threat Studies, 1990s, Joshua Carell's experiments on police decisions all pointed in the same direction. The system shapes the person. The label determines performance. The expectation creates the result. Today, decades later, what Jane Elliott started in that Riceville classroom is still continuing. Elliott, in her 80s, her hair stark white, her voice still sharp, her gaze still defiant, is still making speeches, still asking people uncomfortable questions. If you wouldn't want to wear a blue collar for a day, why do you allow others to wear that collar every day? And this question has never been answered, never grown old, never become unnecessary today. Because the world changes, but the mechanism remains the same. Label, hierarchy, privilege, exclusion. Only their colors and names change. That blue collar placed around the neck of a third-grade student in a small classroom in Riceville on the morning of April 5, 1968, is still on the necks of different people in different forms everywhere in the world today. And the most important thing Jane Elliott taught us is this: it is not those who wear the collar, but those who remain silent to the existence of that collar, who ensure the continuation of the system. And silence is not always neutrality, it is most often complicity. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed the video, you can support me by liking and subscribing. Until we see each other in our next video, stay curious.